Hello and welcome to Cultural Apologists React for today, September 21st, 2024. This is an AI-generated podcast intended as an engaging, relevant, and informative way to explore what Christian cultural apologists might think about the day's news. But like all AI, it can make mistakes. Use it for generating possible ideas, but don't rely on it as an authoritative guide to the day's news or to the details of cultural apologetics. A study found that labeling tweets with false claims about election fraud as disputed had little effect on changing the minds of Donald Trump voters and may have made them more likely to believe the lies. The study, which surveyed 1,072 Americans in December 2020, showed that Trump voters who were initially skeptical about claims of widespread fraud were more likely to rate lies as true when a disputed label appeared next to Trump's tweets. This effect was particularly pronounced among Trump voters with high levels of political knowledge who strengthened their belief in election misinformation when exposed to disputed tags. The study's findings suggest that fact-checking labels may be less effective the more politically knowledgeable Trump voters become, and may even reinforce misinformation among this group. Commentary: The nuances of correction. A paradox of persuasion in the age of misinformation. In an era marked by a cacophony of conflicting narratives, it has become increasingly clear that our attempts to correct falsehoods can sometimes have an unintended consequence, reinforcing error rather than dispelling it. When we label tweets with false claims as disputed, do we truly expect to change the minds of those who cling to misconceptions? Or, as C.S. Lewis so perceptively noted in his book Christian Reflections, might we inadvertently be strengthening their resolve? Lewis's words continue to resonate like a gentle whisper, cautioning us against the dangers of simplistic assumptions about human persuasion. When it comes to ideology or theology, our disagreements often boil down to a clash of worldviews, an incompatibility of perspectives that defy easy resolution. This is not simply a matter of facts versus fiction. Rather, it's about the deeply personal and emotional investment we have in our convictions. The recent study highlights this paradox with striking clarity. Labeling tweets with false claims had little effect on changing the minds of Donald Trump voters, and may even have made them more likely to believe the lies. But what does this tell us about the nature of human persuasion? Perhaps it's not just a matter of presenting facts or evidence. Perhaps our attempts at correction can actually be counterproductive, especially when we're dealing with those who are deeply invested in their own worldview. In his book Christian Reflections, Lewis notes that the Christian approach to literature and criticism must take into account this paradox of correction. We cannot simply assume that our message will be received with an open heart. Rather, we must engage with others in a spirit of constructive dialogue, even when our attempts at persuasion may fall short. But what happens when our efforts to correct falsehoods fail? Do we become discouraged, thinking that our message is not getting through? Or do we recognize that this failure can actually be an opportunity for growth and spiritual development? Lewis's words offer us a clue. The nearest I can come to it is to say that I found a disquieting sense of being in the wrong. When we encounter disagreement or resistance, perhaps we should not see this as a sign of failure, but rather as a reminder that our own perspectives and assumptions may be incomplete. In his book, Christian Reflections, Lewis also notes that the Christian approach to literature and criticism must be characterized by humility. We must be willing to listen to others, to engage in dialogue, even when we disagree. And yet, when we encounter resistance or disagreement, how often do we become defensive or dismissive? Perhaps it's time for us to rethink our approach to correction and persuasion. The study's findings suggest that fact-checking labels may be less effective the more politically knowledgeable Trump voters become, and may even reinforce misinformation among this group. But what does this tell us about the nature of human persuasion? Is it not possible that our attempts at correction can actually be counterproductive when we're dealing with those who are deeply invested in their own worldview? As Lewis so perceptively observed, I think I have something to say about what may be called the Christian approach to literature, about the principles, if you will, of Christian literary theory and criticism. Perhaps it's time for us to revisit these principles to see how they might inform our approach to correction and persuasion in the digital age. Ultimately, this paradox of correction forces us to confront a difficult truth: that our attempts to set straight may not always be successful. But even when we fail, perhaps we can find value in the process of engagement and persuasion itself. For it is through this dialogue, however imperfect, that we may yet come to see each other's perspectives, and maybe even learn from one another. In an era marked by a cacophony of conflicting narratives, perhaps it's time for us to rethink our approach to correction and persuasion. Maybe we need to move beyond the simplistic assumption that labeling falsehoods as disputed will somehow magically change people's minds. Instead, let us engage with others in a spirit of constructive dialogue, recognizing that this process itself may hold value, even when our attempts at correction fail. Only then can we begin to understand the true nature of human persuasion, and perhaps even find ways to overcome the paradox of correction that Lewis so perceptively noted all those years ago. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Cultural Apologists React. Be sure to come back tomorrow for a new take on the day's news from the standpoint of Christian cultural apologists.